get us started with a word and a prayer. Please join me. We'll pray first, but I'm going to share some excerpts from a letter that was written together by the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew with Pope Francis and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and I am a member of the Anglican Church, so I get to join in the spirit of this letter, and I'll just read you a couple of excerpts from the letter that they released in September 2021, a joint message for the protection of creation. May we not waste this moment. We must decide what kind of world we want to leave to future generations. God mandates, choose life so that you and your children might live. Deuteronomy 30:19. We must choose life differently, choose to live differently. We must choose life. The current climate crisis speaks volumes about who we are and how we view and treat God's creation. We stand before a harsh justice. Biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, climate change are the inevitable consequences of our actions, since we've greedily consumed more of the Earth's resources than the planet can endure. But we also face a profound injustice. The people bearing the most catastrophic consequences of these abuses are the poorest on the planet and have been the least responsible for causing them. We serve a God of justice who delights in creation and creates every person in God's image, but also hears the cry of people who are poor, and I would say under threat. Accordingly, there's an innate call within us to respond with anguish when we see such devastating injustice. We repent of our generation's sins. And then they turn to an imperative of cooperation. These crises present us with a choice. We're in a unique position either to address them with short-sightedness and profiteering or seize as an opportunity for conversion and transformation. If we think of humanity as a family and work together toward a future based on the common good, we could find ourselves living in a very different world. Together we can share a vision for life where everyone flourishes. Together we can choose to act with love, justice, and mercy. Together, we can walk towards a fairer and fulfilling society with those who are most vulnerable at the center. But this involves making changes. Each of us individually must take responsibility for the ways we use our resources. This path requires an ever closer collaboration among all churches in their commitment to care for creation. Together, as communities, churches, cities, and nations, we must change route and discover new ways of working together to break down the traditional barriers between peoples, to stop competing for resources and start collaborating. And again, we recall Scripture. Choose life so that you and your children may live. Choosing life means making sacrifices and exercising self-restraint. All of us, wherever and whoever we are, can play a part in changing our collective response to the unprecedented threat of climate change and environmental degradation, and we can add in here the wars that are related to them, and we'll explore that more together. Caring for God's creation is a spiritual commission requiring a responsive commitment. And they end with these words, this is a critical moment. So let me open with a word of prayer for creation and a word of prayer for peace from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Please join me. O merciful Creator, your loving hand is open wide to satisfy the needs of every living creature. Make us always thankful for your loving providence, and give us grace to honor you with all that you have entrusted to us, that we, remembering the account we must one day give, may be faithful stewards of your good gifts. And O Lord, eternal God, in whose perfect kingdom no sword is drawn but the sword of righteousness, no strength known but the strength of love, so mightily spread abroad your Spirit, that all peoples may be gathered under the banner of the Prince of Peace, to whom be dominion and glory, now and forever. Amen.
Good evening. My name is Ken Shiha, and I'm the Director of Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation. And on behalf of Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, I would like to welcome you to our panel discussion on the war against Ukraine and the climate crisis. What do they have in common? We are honored to co-sponsor this event with Duke Center for Reconciliation. Last month, we held an ecumenical prayer vigil, praying in solidarity for peace in the Ukraine. Tonight, I would like to begin our discussion by framing it within two themes important to the overall vision of Pope Francis' encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. The first theme focuses on the encyclical's audience and methodological approach. Like all Catholic social encyclicals, Laudato Si is addressed not only to the Church, but to all people of goodwill. There's continuity in this message. Catholic social teaching calls for collegiality of all people seeking peace and common care for God's creation. Conversations, like our panel discussion tonight, are essential to this process. The panelists will share their unique perspectives on the ways the war in Ukraine connects to our current climate crisis. Pope Francis describes true wisdom as the fruit of self-examination, dialogue, and generous encounter between persons. Dialogues are how we grow in relationship, promote human dignity, and the common good. Only through an integrated approach, with all people at the table, learning from one another, can we be empowered with a broadened perspective. Put succinctly, the method and approach matter. The second theme relates to the profound theological anthropology, or understanding of the human person, asserted in Laudato Si. The Pope describes how the creation accounts in the book of Genesis suggest that life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. According to the Bible, these three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. This rupture is sin. The harmony between the Creator, humanity, and creation as a whole was disrupted by our presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge our creaturely limitations. Hence, for Pope Francis, our ecological crisis is one small sign of the ethical, cultural, and spiritual crisis of modernity. We cannot presume to heal our relationship with nature and the environment without healing all fundamental human relationships. Therefore, Pope Francis affirms that authentic human development has a moral character. He continues, environmental deterioration and human and ethical degradation are closely linked. Once again, the Pope morally connects both our throwaway consumerist culture, environmental abuse, and wars we see in places like Ukraine. Yet, even in the frailty and vulnerability of these current crises, there is hope that all could be made new again. Laudato Si helps Christians realize that their responsibility within creation and their duties towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. We have come to recognize that genuine care for our own lives and our relationships with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others. War, neglect, and environmental destruction do not have to define our legacy. As we listen to our panelists tonight, let us pray for a conversion experience in our minds, hearts, and actions. Hope for peace in Ukraine and for addressing climate change begins with the transformation in us, a change in how we choose to live in relationships with one another and in the world. In the spirit of Laudato Si, we have several panelist speakers tonight. They will be followed by a time for questions from the audience, a call to action, and a concluding prayer. Our first panelist is Father Jacek Orzechowski, who was born and grew up in Poland. He joined the Franciscan Friars of the Holy Name Province in 1995 and was ordained in 2002 after receiving his Master of Divinity degree from Washington Theological Union. Immaculate Conception Parish was his first assignment from 2002 to 2008. He subsequently served for 9 years at St. Camilla's Church in Silver Spring, Maryland, and the last 3 years at Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., as the Director of Community Organizing and Advocacy. In September 2020, Father Jacek was appointed pastor of Immaculate Conception Catholic Church. He is also a member of the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Animation Committee for the entire Franciscan Order. Father Jacek, thank you for being with us this evening.
great to see you all. And recently I spoke with one of my Franciscan brothers who is a guardian of a large Franciscan community in southwestern part of Poland, and in the monastery of Panewniki. And he was telling me about the efforts of the Franciscans in Poland to receive the refugees. There are many dozens of families from Ukraine that have been taken in by parishioners of that community. And
Hello,
also,
everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on the panel.
And extending invitation also to by people from the parish. And right now, at this point, there are about 2.8 million refugees, Ukrainian refugees in Poland. That amounts to about over 7% of the population, of the current population of Poland. So just by comparison, imagine that in a span of what, 2 months, there is a surge in the refugee population into the United States in the number of over 24 million. So kind of the scale of it. And certainly I'm very impressed with the response of the Franciscans in Poland and also Franciscans here in the United States. We're trying to kind of raise the money and pray, but certainly it is not enough. As followers of Jesus, we are called to follow in his footsteps, with not only with charity but with justice. And justice compels us to ask questions, questions about the connections, the connection between what is going on right now, the war against the Ukraine, carried out by Vladimir Putin and his army, and the fossil fuels, and how is it interconnected with the larger war that is going on. There is a war going on right now against the poor, against the future generations, and even though the bombs are not being dropped, but in a way the stage is being set for catastrophe, and there are different actors. It's not necessary in this case only Vladimir Putin, but it's those that oppose progress on climate justice. And here, again, before I go into that, I just want to maybe kind of pause and again emphasize that I speak not as a wannabe politician or economist. I speak as a person of faith, like you, as a follower of Jesus. We are just celebrated Easter. Now Easter, a time when the forces of life triumphs over death, and when we reflect on the message of Jesus, who came to bring peace, but then sends out regular people like ourselves to take on the mission of bringing the good news to the poor, of the ministry of healing, of opening the eyes of the blind. I would say also of the Jesus in his life was about expelling the demons, and we too are called to expel the demons, not in a kind of Hollywoodish sense, but the demons of greed, the demons of human indifference, of violence that is being carried out. And again, there are different actors kind of in that. Even right now, as the Arctic and Antarctic are fastly heating up, just last month, just a few weeks ago, you may have heard about the average temperature in the Antarctic being about 70 degrees above the normal. Kind of the signs of seriousness and of urgency. So that's in Antarctic. We have the bombs being dropped different places across the Ukraine and causing the crises. At the same time, we are, as Christians, are called to not only look at the symptoms, but some of the causes. Again, Pope Francis, in particular, in his two encyclicals, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, called for an integrated approach, solution, connecting the dots, looking at it in a holistic way. So, just I want to kind of offer a few facts. Since the signing of the Paris Climate Change Treaty in Paris in 2016, the Western banking institutions have invested $1.17 trillion in funding fossil fuel development, and much of it in the Arctic. You may have remember how the former ExxonMobil chief and former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson received an order of friendship from Vladimir Putin for his contribution to expanding, even though we knew where we were going, that this is that deal. And again, many of the banks, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase, bankrolling not only the expansion of the fossil fuel kind of industry, but also providing, kind of giving power to despots, be it in Russia or in Saudi Arabia. We have in the United States those people like Senator Joe Manchin, the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, who personally benefited from political donations from fossil fuel industry. He's number one recipient of those donations. And this is blood money. As a person who stood and single-handedly kind of blocked the progress on climate justice, on Build Back Better Act, that was kind of in the way. That's the work. Like here, Saint Basil the Great, one of the fathers of the church, said, "The greed is the dung of the devil." And if there is a need for expelling, exercising the current, the contemporary demons of greed, of corruption, that leads to death, not only kind of in Ukraine, but also paves the way for this death and destruction, we need to, as people, make connections between the fossil fuel expansions and political corruption. Again, not just Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs, but those who profit. We have the Coke industries that, on one hand, have heavily invested in fossil fuel kind of infrastructure, in expanding in the United States, in other places, that at the same time undermine our democracy, our ability to solve the problems. That's kind of part of the corrosive, the problems that we are dealing with. As Christians, we are called to solidarity, certainly with people of Ukraine, but also to work on issues that are directly kind of related to justice. Everything is profoundly interconnected. We are blessed with Pope Francis, who provides kind of a certain kind of framework for dealing with the issues, connecting the dots between environmental crises and social crises, the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. And I would just add that we as people in the United States need to pay a greater attention to the crisis of our democracy and deal with the evil of political corruption at home that has direct repercussions on what goes on be it in Russia or in Saudi Arabia or Yemen and other parts of the world. This is what we are kind of called to do in solidarity with those who suffer.
Our next speaker is Dr. Svetlana Romanko. She is a Zero Fossil Fuels campaign manager for the Laudato Si movement and is based in Ukraine. Dr. Romanko has been an environmental lawyer for 20 years. She holds a PhD in environmental, natural resources, land and agrarian law, and a doctorate on climate change law, climate governance, and climate policy. She also has worked for the 350.org campaigned for just green recovery and Green Deal in Eastern Europe. We are truly honored to have Dr. Romanko sharing her thoughts with us this evening.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on the panel. I'm Svetlana Romanko, Doctor of Environmental Law, a climate justice activist, and Zero Fossil Fuel campaign manager for Laudato Si movement. I will speak today about the interconnections between the war in Ukraine, climate crisis, and the fossil fuels. So the war in Ukraine is not just another conflict. Besides the dreadful death, destruction, violence, terror and genocide against thousands of Ukrainians killed during shelling, bombing, and missile attacks of Russian troops, it has already affected 1.7 billion people in 107 countries who are now faced with rising prices for food and energy. Cities like Mariupol, Bucha, Volnovakha, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv are being leveled to the ground. Thousands of civilians have been brutally murdered, raped, and tortured, and mass graves have been found in those areas liberated from Russian occupation. The people of Ukraine are marshalling a heroic resistance to Putin's war and aggression, a war only made possible by the world's dependence on Russian oil and gas. Even in the midst of this horrific war, Ukrainians have been clear-eyed about calling on the rest of the world to get off oil and gas as a way to stop fueling Putin's war machine and the growing climate crisis. Svetlana Krakovska, Ukraine's representative to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, put it best. Human-induced climate change and the war on Ukraine have the same roots, fossil fuels and our dependence on them. Ukrainian organizations are calling on the world to end this fossil fuel addiction once and for all. Russia's economy is based overwhelmingly on the export of oil and gas, which makes up 60% of total exports and 40% of their federal budget that comes from oil and gas. And that has allowed Putin to grow and empower his military build-up. And the fossil fuel industry of Russia is among the worst in the world in terms of the climate. For decades, Western oil companies courted Putin and helped him exploit Russia's vast reserves. Supported by banks in Western countries, they have poured billions into Putin's war chest and turned a blind eye to his violent expansion efforts. Putin has deliberately weaponized fossil gas to increase his existing energy dominance over the European Union and to threaten European nations that would come to Ukraine's aid. Still now, Germany, Austria and Hungary hesitant to put a full embargo on oil and gas to end war in Ukraine, because these sanctions are the most effective. And the fossil fuel industry is using Russia's invasion of Ukraine to expand investments in oil and gas. The conflict clearly shows how dangerous our dependence on a fossil fuel system is, especially one that concentrates power in the hands of elites like Putin. Since 2016, the global Catholic climate movement, now known as Laudato Si movement, has championed the fossil fuel divestment movement within the church. And for now, we have 307 Catholic institutions who divested over $14 trillion from the fossil fuel industry. In the last year, we've made 5.7 billion of US dollars divested from fossil fuel industry. And I call on you, divest from fossil fuel industry now. It's never been a better time to do it and to make your moral and ethical choice to end the war in Ukraine and to stop climate crisis everywhere, to tackle climate crisis everywhere in the world within your divestments. Please fill in registration form on our Laudato Si movement divestment webpage, and we will announce the divestment commitments on July the 5th. And actually saying so, I have to say that it's imperative that the world not simply replace Russian-produced fossil fuels, in particular fossil gas, with fossil fuels from other countries, in particular liquefied natural gas. With an imagined priority of boycotting Russian oil and gas, fossil fuel expansion must be immediately halted, and nations worldwide must commit to the fast and just transition away from all fossil fuels. Reliance on coal, oil and gas is the intentional embrace of death, misery and collapse in Ukraine and at a global scale. It's our duty to finally get real about that if we want to have a livable future and to end war in Ukraine, conflicts in any other part of the world, for example, US pipelines, Canada tar sands, and Vaca Muerta in Argentina, ECOP in Africa, and new fossil fuel investments into Asia everywhere. We have a unique chance to both tackle and find the solutions for a climate crisis and for the war in Ukraine and conflicts in many other parts of the world that have been fueled by fossil fuels. And the war in Ukraine and the rise in price of fossil fuels also underscores the need for new bold proposals like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty to phase out oil, gas and coal and move the world rapidly to cleaner, safer and distributed energy solutions. To meet rising demand for energy and get on a pathway consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, investment in clean energy needs to triple by 2030. Fortunately, there is enough renewable energy potential in every region of the world to meet energy needs with existing technologies. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to contact me, please just email me on Svetlana@laudatosimovement.org and I will respond to you. Let's keep in touch. Thank you so much for the invitation and attention.
we're very thankful for Dr. Romanko presenting this evening. Our next presenter is Dr. Nina Valmocera, who was born and raised in Lima, Peru. She is a scholar practitioner whose work focuses on education and civic leadership development for justice, peace, and reconciliation. She holds a law degree from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, master's degrees in international peace studies and in government, and a PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame du Lac. Dr. Valmocera is the Associate Director of the Center for Reconciliation and an Associate Teaching Professor of Reconciliation at Duke University's Divinity School. She is the President and CEO of Peace and Hope International. Dr. Valmocera, thank you for sharing your insights with us tonight.
Such a pleasure to be with you. I really appreciate that you came. Thank you. A word of gratitude to all of you for being here, and to Father Juskis and our dear brother Ken Chiha and Dr. Ryan Juskis. I am so honored. And of course, Dr. Svetlana, all the way from Ukraine, contributing to this dialogue. I bring you the warmest greetings from students, faculty, and staff at Duke Divinity, and also from our colleagues at Peace and Hope International. There is no doubt for anyone who calls on the name of our Lord Jesus that our calling to follow Jesus is a call to become peacemakers and peace builders. So we must work for genuine conflict transformation. If we are honest, this is probably one of the top needs in the world. We are in the midst of on the verge of another global war, and even if that third world war does not happen, as it's our prayer that it will not happen, as Father Juskis said earlier, there are too many wars going on. Outright violence, but also systemic injustice. That means violence against the most vulnerable. So in the face of such blatant abuse of power, as the case of the aggression against the Ukraine, we cannot remain neutral. In order to pursue true conflict transformation, we really need to understand the facts. And this means identifying the factors at play in any conflict. This war, the war of aggression from Russia against Ukraine, is not an accident. It is intricately connected with our dependence on fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, and the abusive exploitation of God's planet, and the way in which we respond to that excessive demand for fossil fuels. There are several aspects in this conflict, of course. No one here pretends to oversimplify the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. There are matters of geopolitical security at play, for sure. But no less important are the matters related to the dependence on fossil fuels. I will focus on the latter factors, acknowledging that there are other factors as well. I'd like to state that we need to understand that Russia is a petrostate. This means that the Putin regime depends on the money it gets from selling natural gas and oil to Europe, especially many places in the world, but especially to Europe. And the Putin regime itself depends for success with the Russian people on two tools. One is outright violence and the elimination of fundamental rights of people, elimination of access to free information, and the elimination of free expression. The other tool is sustaining the Putin economy with the revenue that comes from selling fossil fuels. For years, Russia has been paying millions of dollars to Ukraine to have its natural gas and oil go through pipelines through Ukrainian territory. Recently, Russia has started building other pipelines surrounding Ukraine, but the problem has been that about 10 years ago, new deposits of natural gas and oil were found in Ukrainian territory and the Black Sea that surrounds the country. This has created an even more urgent desperation for the Putin regime to have control of Ukraine. In other words, Ukraine threatens the oil and gas supremacy of Russia in the world. As you can see, the demand for oil and natural gas is literally fueling this war. And the Putin regime was emboldened by assuming that Western Europe would not respond strongly against its attacks because Putin assumed that Western European countries would not risk their access to oil and gas. To conclude these brief remarks, the climate crisis that threatens our world, which is God's world, and the Russian aggression against Ukraine have the same cause: our great dependence on fossil fuels. Our sister Svetlana Romanko so articulately has shared with us in her message that we must intentionally reduce our dependence on fossil fuel, and not only reduce our own consumption, which is, we have to start at home, right? We need to reduce our own consumption, but to take it one step farther and also not invest our resources, our economic resources, probably for most of us, small resources, but for some people and for many people in the United States, humongous financial resources should not be invested in the exploitation of oil or gas, but in looking for alternative, sustainable, clean ways of securing energy to respond to human needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Valmocera. Our final presenter is Dr. Ryan Juskis, who grew up in New Jersey and was raised by Catholics, Jews, and evangelicals. He has a PhD in religion with an emphasis in Christian studies and ethics from Duke University, where he studied relationships between Christian thought, environmental justice, and ethics. Dr. Juskis currently serves as a teacher scholar at Wake Forest University, where he offers courses on ethical environmental leadership. He is also the vice chair of the Peace and Hope International Board of Directors. Peace and Hope International is a Christian nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing and confronting violence and other forms of injustice. Working through its sister organizations in Latin America, Peace and Hope seeks to promote structural transformation, mobilizing and supporting communities, families, and individuals to actively engage in local and national peace-building efforts. Dr. Juskis, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, so being raised by Jews, Catholics, and evangelicals, just trying to cover all my bases. Hoping one of those groups got things right. Maybe all of them. But first of all, my thanks to Nina for the most immediate invite, and to Ken and Father Jacek for the invite to be here and share with you. This is not my primary area of expertise in Eastern Europe, but I do look at the relationships between fossil fuels and culture and faith and religion, and so I'd like to draw some connections in that vein. And as I was preparing for this, I was thinking there's kind of three different possible directions I think I could go with these comments. One would be sort of looking at the more obvious things, if you will. I think like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, robbing attention, resources, energy from international climate processes, right? That's one. The invasion has also effectively reversed President Biden's policy agenda from an ambitious pro-renewables agenda to increasing and expanding our American fossil fuel capacity and production. That's another one. Another one, the invasion has revealed how much the flow of fossil fuels impacts global geopolitics, as Nina talked about. And then there are the linkages in a kind of a second kind of capacity we could look at that are slightly less obvious, but rather easy to understand and conceptualize when you learn about them, such as misinformation. And certainly Russia's war against Ukraine and the climate change, particularly opposition to climate change action, are very much invested in managing and funding different kinds of narrative and misinformation campaigns. That's another connection. Another one is that the Russian invasion has catalyzed a whole battle of narratives by the proponents of fossil fuels and the proponents of renewables, right? So there's this whole battle over the kind of meaning that we make of what is going on right now. A crisis like this makes new stories, new alliances, new futures possible. It's another way we could go. Another one, the Donbass, you've heard of that. That's now the strategic focus of the Russian invasion. It's the southeastern region of Ukraine, and it is the coal region, Donbass. The Don means Donetsk, and Bass means basin. It's the Donetsk coal basin, and it's where the coal in Ukraine comes from, largely. And Mariupol and Donetsk, these are like kind of the Pittsburghs and the Birminghams, if you will, of Ukraine. These are industrial cities of coal and steel, and this is why there are a lot of Russian speakers who've come since the Industrial Revolution to those cities and why they speak Russian in those cities. So you get to see some of the kind of linguistic and cultural roots of the current conflict. But what I want to do with the rest of my time here is kind of not to focus on those. I want to draw our attention to some aspect of this Russia's war against Ukraine and climate change and the links between them that I think are very significant and yet are nevertheless far less perceptible and actually perhaps even closer to home than we might imagine. I think they're harder to perceive and that makes them all that much more dangerous in a sense. And so I want to build on some insights in what are generally called the environmental or energy humanities, and I could give you some resources if you want to look at that, what that is. But when we think of climate change, we usually think of what, like the COP26 in Glasgow. We think of the Paris Climate Accords. We think of these big international gatherings, the International Panel on Climate Change, melting glaciers, wildfires, 1.5 degrees, things like that, right? But sometimes this can actually distract us, I think, from the very obvious, which is that climate change is first and foremost about fossil fuels, particularly the greenhouse gases that are emitted when we mine, transport, store, process, burn, and then dispose of the remnants of coal, oil, and gas. And our relationships to fossil fuels go very deep, very, very deep, I think, actually more deeper than we can even understand, I would argue. Ours is a petroculture. Nina talked about Russia being a petro-state. We are also a petro-state, and our culture is a petroculture. And so it's hard to think outside of those terms that we have grown up in and swam in since we were born, largely. Fossil fuels have largely been an invisible substrate of our whole modern world and our modern processes, modernization, urbanization, secularization, mechanization, all of these sorts of things in the modern world have been driven in many ways by fossil fuels, and more recently what we could call maybe medicalization and globalization. But fossil fuels also won us the Civil War. Sorry, I'm from the north. Fossil fuels particular fossil fuels actually won World War I. It was oil versus coal. The Allies were oil-based, Germany coal-based, right? So you get to look at history and how much fossil fuels have shaped our world that we live in at this moment, also shaped the Cold War, both sides being fueled by fossil fuels and a kind of petro-modernity, if you will, a kind of fossil-fueled modernity. There's an author, Barbara Fries, wrote a great book, Coal, A Human History, and she says that there's this whole pattern that developed right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the first big shift to coal in England, and I think this pattern is still with us. She says the pattern, the difficulty of hauling coal had always been one of its greatest drawbacks as a fuel, but now through the locomotive, right, the train, coal could haul itself. Similarly, through the steam engine, coal could pump the mines that contained it. The patterns were the same. Coal created a problem, then helped power a solution. And that solution would have revolutionary consequences far beyond the coal industry. I think we see that not just with coal, but we see it with oil, we'll see it with natural gas. What we have right now is another crisis, another fossil fuel crisis. And we are at risk of solving another fossil fuel crisis with more fossil fuels, and by actually deepening the problem. And so how do we get at the roots of some of this? One angle I want to take here is to look at connection between climate change and the war against Ukraine, that focuses on fossil fuels, autocratic politics, and what are some now calling global culture wars. That's where I think it comes a little bit closer to home. A number of scholars, and I would point you to their work, Christina Stokel and Dmitry Uzlaner, they recently wrote in the Washington Post a fantastic article on this just a couple days ago. I suggest you look it up. And also David Brooks in the New York Times has written about this recently too, that there's been a shift from kind of globalization and these ideas of kind of the globe coming together around liberal values and whatnot to a kind of global culture wars, where what we see now are these conflicts. If you could think about culture wars in America sort of writ large, and that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an aspect of this. Russia sees itself, and has increasingly over the last 10, 12, 15 years, has come to see itself largely through connections with culture warriors in the U.S., focus on the family, groups like this, if you've heard of them, as the vanguard of a global culture war, a vanguard against the kind of moral degradation of the liberal West. Ukraine is also, this came about through very close relationships between Vladimir Putin and the Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and the Russian Orthodox Church that have built a whole vision of what the quote-unquote Russian world, the Ruski Mir, involves. And what it involves is Russia as a Christian nation that whose task is to defend Christian values, traditional values, the family, sexuality, institutions like the church, authority, against the liberalizing influence from the West. And you might be scratching your head thinking, I know nothing about this, because it has not gotten a lot of coverage. But I think this is one very immediate cause of the conflict in Ukraine, because some 75% of Ukrainians identify as Orthodox as well, and many of them are in it's a very complicated church structure, but under, in a sense, the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church and Patriarch Kirill. And so this conflict has in many ways been a conflict within Orthodoxy over the kind of a turn to the liberal West, if you will, pluralism, democracy, freedom, values like that, and Eastern autocracy. And in many ways, this is a battle over what it means to be Orthodox, what it means to be Christian in this kind of world, and then throw fossil fuels into the mix, and I'll get there in a second. So Russia very much sees itself right now as counteracting the West's moral degradation and collapse. And this has been a vision, like I said, that's been developed by Vladimir Putin and Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, especially since 2010 and Putin's third term. He did not start as a public figure in this way, but he has come to embrace it. It's almost as if you remember the Cold War, it's almost as if the structure has been inverted, where Russia now has positioned itself as sort of the defender of Christian values and freedom and institutions against a godless Western liberalizing society. So if you see that as inverted, I think it's because it is. Russia's positioning itself again as that defender against the secularizing effects of liberal democracy. And the West very much seen in this vision as spiritually hollow and weak. And that's an important part, as weak, right? And this is why Putin felt that he could invade, because the West talks a big game, they have a lot of money, but deep inside they're hollow and they're weak, and they're not going to do anything about this. So what's the answer to weakness? Well, it is strength. And this is, again, where fossil fuels come in. You make a lot of money. Russia makes $700 million on oil every single day, $400 million on natural gas every day. And a lot of that goes into buying weapons and growing their power. So I want to conclude here by saying I think there's a couple sort of upshots to this analysis, if you will. How are these things connected? Fossil fuels, kind of autocratic governance, and culture wars. But I think what it does is it brings it closer to home, in a sense. Many of us, regardless of whether you see yourself as kind of quote-unquote progressive or orthodox or traditional or whatever, I'm not here to tell you what to be, but to say that what is it that we're willing to hitch our moral vision of society to? What kinds of wealth, what kinds of sources of that wealth, what kinds of energy? because fossil fuels have always fueled larger projects. They've always been storied. They've always been kind of put towards particular ends. And so we could think about what kinds of vision are fossil fuels being hitched to today, and what are we willing to hitch our own moral vision to? A second is what it might look like to decarbonize our own faith. In many ways, as Christians, I think we have participated in actually carbonizing, if you will, our own faith and our own faith practices, our institutions, our modes of connection, even sometimes our prayers. What does it mean then? What would it mean for us to be models of decarbonizing faith, of living a good life, a virtuous life, a fulfilled life that is not dependent on fossil fuels? We can model that. This is not just austerity and giving up good things. It is also adding in good things. Faith like ours goes back many years, back before fossil fuels. And so there are a lot of traditions we can draw on to decarbonize our own faith that are already existing in our traditions. So I will leave it there, and I think we could maybe address some more of the other questions and things. I threw some out there for you if we want to address some of them in question and answer time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Juskis. So right now we'll want to thank all of our panelists, obviously, and we're going to invite them up front. Yep. Thank you. We're going to invite them up front right now for a very brief question and answer period. If anyone from the audience, we're going to invite Brittany up. And Brittany is going to be holding the microphone. You can line up behind her in the aisle. If you just come up front, Brittany. Thank you so much. And for anyone who has any questions, you can just line up behind Brittany, and you can ask of our panelists any questions you may have, or we can address ones as well from the moderator. So if anyone who has any questions, feel free to come up right now and ask away. Sure. You could just come up behind Brittany. Sure. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Could you tell us again how much Putin is making, or Russia makes, from fossil fuels?
Yes, the number I've most recently read is $700 million a day from oil, $400 million US dollars from natural gas.
Per day.
And traditionally, oil has always been sold and bought in US dollars. So
Okay.
that may be changing right now.
Thank you. And then so an interesting point that was made was that, until 10 years ago, Ukraine was making millions of dollars allowing Russia to flow through. It's always interesting, like, until it, hurts you, do things, become an issue. So I totally understand, and it's devastating, everything that's happening, but I think sometimes it takes such a traumatic event for people to say, this has to stop, because if things were going well, I guess, for Ukraine, they would just kept allowing the money to flow in, and it would have been good, and then until it's not. And it's like, what is it that's going to happen to all of us at some point for us to wake up and say, things have to stop? So I thought that was a very interesting fact that you shared with us. Thank you.
Something I didn't mention, but it's part of the equation, is that also the predecessors were always very amicable to Putin, like very willing to do as he wished, not with Zelensky.
If I could add something to that too, because this was a theme that came out of both of your talks, was the question of violence. And you brought up the notion that in a sort of war against the poor and future generations. And this is one way that some people have thought about environmental issues, particularly the social side of environmental issues, environmental injustice, as a kind of quote-unquote slow violence, if you've ever heard this term. And the problem, it's the sort of, you could think about pollution in the air or in the water, and it just slowly accumulates in your body, and over time, right? You can develop health problems, breathing problems, right? Birth defects and things like that. This is what they call slow violence. The difficulty is in trying to make such slow developing problems seem urgent enough to act on. And what you said reminded me of this. Right? You need these kind of ruptures to try to spark our attention. And this is the problem with slow violence, is it's hard to mobilize around slow-moving problems like that. And so an event like what's going on in Ukraine right now obviously is not moving very slowly. It's the exact opposite. But like you said, it could be this rupture that helps us then to see, actually make visible and clearer for us to see the wider effects of the kind of slow violence that we've been participating in over many, many years, but we can bring attention to it now in new ways.
So we also had some questions people had sent in, or we talked about with the panel. One of them was, given Europe's current dependency on Russia for fossil fuels, what does a reasonable expectation look like for a decrease or transition from fossil fuels to alternative energy sources in the context of this current war against Ukraine?
I think it's certainly a moral call, moral challenge to faith communities to kind of connect the dots between fossil fuels and violence, either violence inflicted on the people of Ukraine, violence inflicted on the people of Yemen, who are being also bombed with the support of the United States, and on the future generations. So one thing is kind of, and Svetlana spoke about it, about divestments from fossil fuels. For individuals, for institutions, be it religious institutions, educational institutions. I just, in the process of learning kind of about the situation in Ukraine, I heard that Chase Bank has been the biggest lender to Russia. Well, that's my credit card, so I gotta do something about it, collectively. It's individual and then using the power that we have, especially as faith communities, institutions, to call for keeping the fossil fuels in the ground, to anything that directly or indirectly kind of endorsing a continuation of the exploitation of the fossil fuels and means a death sentence to future generations, and it's immoral. And ending with the political corruption that paralyzes us as a country from moving forward and making a decisive step in the transition towards green renewable energy. I don't think that what Senator John Manchin is doing, his sense of omission or commission is no less morally reprehensible than what Vladimir Putin is doing.
We actually had a follow-up question on that. When you talk about divestments, someone had asked, has the parish, the Diocese of Raleigh, Duke University, among other institutions, divested from fossil fuels, or do they still have it in their financial portfolios?
Well, I don't know, but this is something that I will be bringing up to the Finance Council, because every faith communities and the parish has, and I don't know, but it's a good question. Any answers from? I don't know about Duke University or where do they have the money invested. Someone may know, but...
So we can start by asking the questions, right? Where does the money for my salary come from? Is it from Duke Investments in oil?
I could share a story. I taught a course once called Faith in Fossil Fuels at Duke, and I had a couple of students who over the course of the semester, I realized they were Catholic students, and I have students work on a case study throughout the class, and a number of them chose to look at Catholics and divestment campaigns. So that was really interesting because they never told me they're Catholic. So anyway, no one tells your teacher you really are. But I thought it was really interesting because I think as undergraduates, they've sort of learned to not talk about their faith, not talk about their upbringing or to distance themselves from it. And what I saw over the course of the students doing this research, a lot of them came to see that Catholic institutions were some of the earliest adopters of the divestment campaign. The amounts were minuscule and very ineffective if what you wanted to do was change the system, but they were extremely symbolic. And that was the important point. And so actually I saw it for me, it's this great story of students at Duke kind of, trying to figure out what their own faith is about, seeing that actually something they really believe in, like taking strong action on climate change, that they could see that actually Catholic institutions have been at the ground level of that campaign.
And we as Franciscans also having those conversations.
Yeah, so people are watching and paying attention.
When we see how quickly a westernized country can be debilitated by this, I've always looked at what do we have in South America that we are essentially ignoring where similar things could happen. Because it seems like in our conversations we become so focused on Western Europe that we frequently do not look at the rest of the world. And I don't know the answer to this question. It's really just a question that I would like to pose for you about what we see as what could occur now that we know how easily this was destabilized.
Let me start and I will come to your comments. Several Latin American countries are experiencing great instability as we speak. I am Peruvian, and when I was growing up, we were living in an internal armed conflict. And it feels right now like my fellow Peruvians are experiencing a similar kind of anxiety with the political instability, the economic crisis, the consequences of the pandemic. And Peru is not the only country in that situation. The peace process in Colombia is very fragile. Brazil is, well-being in Brazil has declined horrendously because of the impact of the pandemic, but I would argue also because of a terrible government, and the impact of fossil fuels in Latin America is also very notorious, and pollution and health issues. But so this is the slow violence that Ryan was talking about earlier, and Father Jacek also alluded to this. But on top of that, there is the hot violence, is that when people in Latin America stand up against companies that are polluting the water, that are extracting minerals, gold, silver, anything, in the name of God or in the name of the land and nature, in the name of the survival of the indigenous communities, those people who resist, the leaders, are many times killed. So today in Latin America, to be for the environment, to speak like the way we are speaking today here, is to risk your life.
For example, in Brazil, in particular, with the current autocratic regime that flaunts ignorance, and it's just the wholesale destruction of the Amazon and exploitation of the fossil fuels, drill baby drill approach, just like some in the United States, just singing to the same tune. Even though right now in South America, as I understand, are right on the tipping point in terms of deforestation. And a couple of years ago, 3 years ago or so, there was a situation in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, where they, like a megapolis of almost 30 million people, they almost ran out of the water. And they only had it like once or twice a week. And it's directly related to fossil fuel, kind of the logic of fossil fuel exploitation, be it cutting down the rainforest or burning up fossil fuels. And then those that are standing up to that logic, many indigenous communities and also in faith communities there or in Africa or different parts of the world this is part of this the movement of the Holy Spirit to bring to bring a sanity and to bring another approach and to turn away from the precipice of catastrophe.
Not sure if there's.
There's two questions on Facebook. One of them is, globally, who benefits from the Russia-Ukraine war?
Who benefits from the war? Globally, who benefits from the war, basically? I would say I think it ties in a little bit to the angle I was trying to explore, which is if you do look globally, there's an enormous sort of resurgence of what used to be called the non-aligned movement, but it is nations, countries that are not choosing sides, if you will. And I do wonder how much of that has to do with Russia's more recent positioning of itself as this global defender of traditional values and institutions. A lot of the countries now that are not choosing sides are in Africa, Latin America. So it raises those questions. That's a question in my mind, so it's not a definitive answer, but I do think that if you think about kind of winners and losers, it is at least very interesting to see what countries are staying silent or even supporting Russia, and see this as kind of the first great shot across the bow in rejection of the kind of moral degradation of democratic, liberal, capitalist West.
I think that in the short term, clearly those that are benefiting are oil producers or the companies that sell oil. Obviously, we know, we feel it every time we fill our tanks. In the long term, I honestly don't know. I think we're all going to lose.
And just put it in the context of what we know as a fact, indisputably, is that according to the newest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that we only have 3 years a window of opportunity to make a decisive action on slashing the emission of the greenhouse gases by 50% within those 3 years to avoid a wholesale climate catastrophe that may result in hundreds of billions of refugees and kind of ripple effects in many parts of the world. So taking that under consideration, there will be no winners in that.
Another question asked on Facebook. Could you explain more on carbonized faith?
Yes, thank you, person online. It's a question I have. I think it's more, I would pose it as a question, which is, we are products of our own cultures as well. And, you know, how much have we as Christians sort of baptized, if you will, the Petrol cultures that we are brought up in, and the air that we breathe, and well, maybe literally the air that we breathe, but thinking more figuratively here. And one way I do wonder about it is, you know, there are a couple of historical ways to look at this. One is very interesting, and actually the Protestant Reformation is when you first see the first big shift to coal in England, partly because the Roman Catholic Church owned a lot of the property, and they mined a little bit of the coal, but not much, and the merchants wanted access to it. And so when Henry VIII left the church and declared a certain kind of spiritual independence, that they quote-unquote secularized the properties around England and made those properties available to merchants, which then kind of catalyzed the first great push for coal in places like Newcastle, the first industrial cities. And so historically, you could look at those sorts of things, what's going on there. I think also you could look at, in a kind of fossilized, fossil regime, petroculture, modern world, so much of our lives, we have come to depend on our livelihood, our well-being, our medicine, our length of life, and whatnot, to fossil fuels. I mean, there's a lot of fossil fuels in our medicine, pills that we take. I mean, to the instruments we use in our hospitals and things like this. Everything that's fancy-looking, clean computers need, right, to be kind of molded and shaped using, you know, the kind of heat that coal and whatnot can provide. And there's a lot of things that can go on and on there. But the point being that I think, in part, then some of our own maybe theologies, in a sense, if so much of our lives and our livelihood has come to sort of depend on these gifts that fossil fuels have given us, it's almost like our kind of the spiritual, religious aspects of our lives are kind of retreated, in a sense, into these kind of corners of our lives, right, or into the afterlife or something like that. When in fact, I think what we read about in Scripture is God cares about all of our lives, our bodies, and it presents us with a vision of what full life, abundant life, actually is in this life. And so how do we get in touch with that? I think that would be a way of kind of quote-unquote decarbonizing our theology, our faith. And I could talk forever about that, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, everyone, so much for your questions. We want to again thank our panelists. Just to conclude the evening, we're going to invite Father Juskis up for a call to action and a closing prayer. So thank you again so much.
Thank you. And in building up on some of the things that Svetlana Romanko spoke about and what she has been involved in, one specific call to action that I would like to share with you is to get involved in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign. And there are three kind of pillars of it: to end new expansion of fossil fuel production. And right now, as you may have heard, that there is a push to open up more public land in the U.S. for oil and gas exploration, so which is incompatible with science and immoral. Phasing out existing production of fossil fuels and investing in a transformation plan to ensure 100% access to renewable energy. So there are you can read more about it, and to advance kind of this conversation in a public forum, there are, for example, cities or states are involved in campaigns to pass those fossil fuel non-proliferation treaties in different localities. So this is something that perhaps, you can organize some people from Durham and move forward with that. Another thing that Catholic Climate Covenant has been advocating for is the effort to influence the legislation in the U.S. Senate and advocate in support of the allocation of $555 billion for Build Back Better Act, and to do it in a way that invest not only renewable energy, but also to do it with equity, lifting up the poor and marginalized communities. And the last thing I just want to mention is the connection between the fossil fuel, the campaign to keep the fossil fuel in the ground and preserving and protecting our democracy, and in a kind of comprehensive way. And here, Poor People's Campaign is doing precisely that. On June 18, there's a big mobilization in Washington, D.C., and Reverend Barber here from North Carolina has been kind of championing it. Franciscan Action Network is one of the organizations that is involved in kind of mobilizing and again to standing up to those, not only to the fossil fuel industry, but oftentimes the same industry is involved in like Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, kind of the right wing, those that started the Tea Party, and they're the ones that have been behind the efforts to undermine the voting rights of African Americans, so anything that we can do to stand up and to counter that is also a step in the right direction, healing our democracy, our ability as a nation to solve the problems, be it social problems, environmental problems. So as you leave, I made some copies, and once again, thank you for coming, and thank those of you that will be watching that are watching us on Facebook Live, and later on we will be making that video available to others. So let us pray. Good and loving God, we give you thanks for being with us in the midst of trials and tribulations, in the midst of violence. You are the ones that calls us to be instruments of your peace and justice. We ask you, oh God, for the people of Ukraine, bring peace. Bring peace to that land and to all the lands that are suffering as a result of systemic injustice and violence. Make us instruments of your reconciliation, and give us courage to see not only the daunting challenges, but so many opportunities to act as your hands, as your feet, as your heart and mind for those who are suffering. Thank you for believing that despite of our limitations and faults, we can do great things. Thank you, Lord. Amen. And thank you for coming.
to pleasure.